welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices. We are very pleased to read your letters and comments, and please send them. Today, we have the founder of Common Good, Philip Howard, Esquire, to be talking with you about his perception and his philosophy of how we can make this world a better, more equitable and fairer world. Our moderator is Apoorv Kabir Gupta, who's on our board of directors. Over to you, Apoorv.
Thank you very much, Dr. Durbach. And Philip, what a pleasure it is having you join us in World Information Transfer's Virtual Voices series. I thank everyone who's joined from around the world. As Dr. Durbach mentioned, we have Philip Howard, who is an extremely impactful voice on the effects of modern law and bureaucracy on human behavior and how we organize a society. He has written multiple books on how we can streamline government and restore individual responsibility. Books you would have heard of: The Death of Common Sense, The Collapse of Common Good. In fact, one of his books, The Death of Common Sense, actually criticized overregulation and excessive litigation. As mentioned, Philip now leads Common Good, which is a nonpartisan, non-for-profit organization. So with that, Philip, I pass the mic on to you to help us and the audience understand what good governance looks like. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Apoorv, and thank you, Christine, for having me. I think we're at one of these points in history where we know things are going to change. It almost feels like it might be 1917 in Russia, where you have no idea. The lunatic Bolsheviks could take over, or it could be someone else. But of course, just as in 1917, we're not sure how it's going to change. And my concern is that, at least in the US, none of the competing visions of left and right are addressing what I think is the main source of voter alienation, which is the sort of lack of respect for people to have ownership of their daily choices, the inability of public institutions actually to act sensibly and get the job done. So I think, whereas in many countries, the debate is between conservatives who want to get rid of government in the guise of deregulation, or perhaps authoritarians who say the only way to make it work is to appoint or to elect essentially some kind of dictator, as has happened in certain kinds of European countries, certain Eastern European countries. And also, I think, with part of the impetus for Trump's election, he's sort of an authoritarian figure in his own blustery way. Or on liberal side, saying we need more government, but without addressing people's frustrations with how government works, whether it's in making school, having schools work effectively, or healthcare be affordable, or such. So I'm going to start with a couple of stories, which I think illustrate what I'm going to argue is really a foundational flaw in the operating systems of modern government. A couple of years ago, a tree fell in a creek in Franklin Township, New Jersey, and it caused flooding. And the mayor sent in a backhoe to pull the tree out of the creek. And then the town lawyer said helpfully, that's a Class C1 creek, and you have to get official permission to pull a natural object out of a Class C1 creek. That's what the law required. So it took them 10 days and $12,000 in legal fees to do what was completely obvious, which was to pull this tree out of the creek. So earlier this year, the COVID virus was first recognized in this country as showing up in Seattle. It happened that there was a flu study ongoing, and that the public health researchers had actually taken swabs from a number of people, and they could have tested those to see what the penetration of the COVID virus was very early. We're talking about January now, in its progression into this country. But they weren't allowed to until they got permission from Washington, from several different agencies, to certify the lab, even though the lab was already being used for this other flu study. and such. So they had to wait weeks, at which point, of course, the virus had spread because the people didn't have the authority to make the decision. Ongoing on the West Coast in the US are these terrible fires. They burned, I think, 4 million acres and such. Well, it turns out that for a number of years, the forest rangers and other fire control officials have been saying that we need to build fire breaks, which are basically, you have controlled burns where you burn areas so that if a fire starts, it will be contained by the fire break and won't keep going for miles and miles. The problem is, to build a fire break in the US, you have to go through an environmental review process. And that allows, among other things, the neighbors to complain and sue if they don't like it. And nobody likes to have a fire, or even a controlled fire in their neighborhood. So almost none of the fire breaks have been built, with the result that we now have really catastrophic fires because we couldn't do what the experts thought was natural, which was to build fire breaks because of the way the law worked. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama at Stanford has said that we've created a modern government that is a vetocracy, like a veto. Anyone can veto anything. And that's an example of sort of why the fire spread. And the last story, this episode, is tens of thousands of people took to the streets this year with all kinds of violence and other deaths and such after this gruesome 8-minute video of a policeman suffocating and killing a man named George Floyd. Now, it turns out that the policeman who did that had a checkered record. It was pretty clear he was not the kind of person who ought to be on the streets with a loaded gun. It just wasn't wired properly. It's just, and had a bad record. But no one in the police department had authority to dismiss him because the way the union contracts have been written in this country, it's basically impossible to get rid of anybody, almost no matter how bad they are, whether it's a teacher, a cop, others. And so we have the people who are managing, supposedly managing the public sector, lack the authority to actually make the judgments about who should be on the street with a loaded gun or not. And the result, second level result, is we had this killing and really sort of mass unrest in the country that all comes down to a kind of inability to manage the police. Now, there's this tendency we have that most experts have to blame the polarization of politics. Society is now too divided, we can't get along, that's why there's so much unrest and stuff. But I actually think that's backwards. I think that the polarization comes from the paralysis, not the other way around. People tend to point fingers and make extreme arguments when they can't get anything done. If they can get something done, they roll up their sleeves and get together and make it done. So evidence of that is in 2009, the Great Recession, so-called, after the mortgage crisis in the US, President Obama was newly in office and Congress allocated over $800 billion to stimulate the economy. And much of this money was supposed to be spent on rebuilding America's decrepit infrastructure, which had gotten a D+ rating from the Engineering Association. So here you had a situation where everyone agreed on the project, rebuild infrastructure. The money was allocated. It was right there. It was in the bank. They were ready to spend the money. Everybody agreed on what it should be spent on. 5 years later, there was a report, and buried in the footnote about how the money was spent. Buried in a footnote was the fact that a grand total of 3.6% of that money got spent on transportation infrastructure. 3.6%. So why is it that even when everybody wants to do something and they're ready to go, that the President of the United States, duly elected majority of people, can't get it done? That's because the process for permitting, as Obama put it, is such that there's, quote, there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. It takes upwards of 10 years to get a permit to go through the process because anybody might complain. I've written a lot about this, and so I'm very involved in the effort to try to rebuild infrastructure. But it's another example of a kind of paralysis in the system where even high-ranking officials, even the president, with approvals, with the money, lack the authority to do the job. So the reason none of these things happen sensibly, whether it's testing for COVID, is that the people were powerless to take responsibility. So why is that? We rebuilt our operating systems in the U.S. since the 1960s. And it largely kind of happened, I think, in the Western world generally. And we rebuilt them on the explicit premise of trying to guarantee against public mistakes by creating detailed codes and processes that tell people exactly how to do things. There'll never again be sort of bad values or bad judgment if we have 1,000-page rule books that tell people exactly how to do things. And if there's going to be a process, we have a process, like, as with infrastructure permitting, that lets anybody who doesn't like it bring a lawsuit and hold it up for years to do that. And the problem is that with this system is that people, in an effort to avoid mistakes, we make it impossible for people to actually get anything done. And so we've kind of institutionalized this kind of form of central planning. It's micromanagement exponential. It's central planning, except the planners are dead. So they don't even get together every 5 years and change the rules. You know, somebody writes a rule in 1983, retires in 1993, and here it is 2020, and the rule is still pushing people around and telling them they can't, you know, take a tree out of a creek. So this is not a problem of the goals of government. It's not a question of whether we want a liberal or conservative government. It's really a problem of the operating system. How do you make things work? And the flaw in the system is the same flaw identified by Friedrich Hayek when he was criticizing, you know, the central planning and such, is that people no longer have the opportunity to take into account the circumstances of time and place. And so the complex shapes of life never end up fitting the square legal holes. So you end up having these people trying to, you know, make something happen when it doesn't quite fit. And the next problem with it is it's incredibly dehumanizing in several ways. First of all, it doesn't honor people's own judgment, their own sense of right and wrong. Secondly, and there's a lot of cognitive scientists have now joined this group, this coalition we're building, because their evidence shows them if you give people too many external criteria that they can't internalize, you actually make their working memory, the conscious part of the brain, you make it freeze. So you actually make people go brain dead because people can't think anymore because they're trying to keep it all straight. They're trying to keep all the rules straight, and they can no longer access the smart part of the brain, the subconscious, the long-term memory. There's a story written about by a person who's a wonderful scholar of bureaucratic behavior called William Simon, who's at Columbia Law School. And there was a researcher in a welfare office in Boston, and a young immigrant mother came, and it turned out she had 4 children. She put the application in too late for one of the children, and she needed to go to the office to fix that. And she needed the welfare because they'd just come to this country, didn't have a job, et cetera. The clerk at the desk, the public employee, said, "Well, I'm sorry, you're too late." And the woman said, "Yes, I know, but all the other criteria are met. They're in school. It's clear I have the children." You know, so then she said, "No, I can't. You're too late." And finally, the final word was, "There is nothing I can do," said the clerk to the woman, who left the office in tears. So a researcher was sitting there, and he went and looked into it. Well, it turned out what she meant was there's nothing that she could do, but the person in the next office had the authority to waive the late filing. But she wasn't thinking that way, not because she was a bad person, because her mind was completely overwhelmed by these external criteria that have nothing to do with right and wrong. And so we've created this caste of people who are trained not to be responsible. You know, they're trained just to comply, and it's profoundly alienating. It contributes to burnout. There's an epidemic of burnout in American schools, among teachers, among doctors, and such, because people are exhausted by trying to keep all this stuff straight, and they're, as opposed to being energized by drawing on their own instincts of right and wrong and their creativity and such. So how do you fix this? As I said, the parties in the US aren't even talking about this. The problem is you can't repair it, and you can't elect a leader who can lead us out of it. You actually have to change the framework, because the law is the law. You can't just say, oh, ignore it. In fact, if you go to any successful school, hospital, whatever, where people are happy, you will find people ignoring all these rules. There are actually studies of that. You know, find any successful large organization, they're not rule bound. And so what does the framework look like? Well, I'll give you an example. Australia in the 1980s had terrible nursing homes. They had a 1,000-page rule book telling people how many peas to put on the plate and everything else, try to make everything uniform. And someone had the bright idea of just throwing away the rule book and replacing it with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents, things like that. The officials didn't lose their authority. Obviously, they had, in some ways, they had more authority because they got to interpret what that meant and such. The experts scoffed. They said people were going to get away with murder, et cetera. They went in a year later. Turned out the nursing homes were twice as good, almost uniformly. And the reason, and this was studied by John Braithwaite and some others, the reason is that people started going to work focusing on what the residents needed, not on compliance with the rule book. And all of a sudden, all that human energy went into making things better for the people in the nursing home. And it didn't do away with disagreements, but now the disagreements were over right and wrong, or what would be better as a home-like setting. So people would sit down, and because everyone's at risk, even if official, turns out that principle-based law, goals-based law, the uncertainty of that brings people together. They need to work it out, because if they take an unreasonable position, they might not win, and the event it goes all the way up to a court or something. So there actually, it's sort of vagueness has virtues. People come together and they talk about, you know, what a home-like setting, and it allowed nursing homes to innovate. So one nursing home might focus on gardening, and another one might focus on some other activity that the people in the nursing home liked. So you had this outpouring of sort of human energy towards constructive purposes instead of the negative energy of trying to avoid getting a ticket for non-compliance with some footfall. So we have this problem. The challenge here is actually not, I think, designing the new systems. I actually think it's quite easy to design a goal-based system because people don't really disagree on the goals. You know, they want a nursing home that has a home-like environment, respects the dignity of the residents. People just aren't going to disagree on that stuff. Or a safe workplace, you name it, or avoiding discrimination, getting rid of pollution, you know, all this. The problem is not actually designing a new system. The problem is figuring out how to walk away from the current system. that we have this huge edifice built up, and the capitals around the world are filled with people whose job it is to interpret and defend the status quo. I mean, that's sort of what people around government do. Well, I'm a lawyer. That's sort of what lawyers do, by and large. That's what lobbyists do. So we need to create, first, a narrative about that we need to rebuild a system of government based on human responsibility and accountability so that people can judge other people without having to prove it. That's really important. So we need a new narrative about making things work again. And then we have to have a coalition that's built of powerful people who give enough cover to a political leader that then a political leader can go out and make this argument. Because no political leader is going to stand up, Joe Biden, not even Donald Trump, and say what I'm saying now, because it's not part of the, it's not in the air. It's not part of what people are breathing when they're talking about public policy. So first we have to make it be part of the air, part of the narrative. Then we need to build a coalition of credible experts and leading citizens and such to make it happen. So my not-for-profit, commongood.org, has campaigned for common good we started this summer. And we launched it with a petition calling for spring cleaning commissions. Let's just clean out the legacy bureaucracies to make them work better. Signed by 100 leading citizens. So we had former senators and governors from both parties, people like Bill Bradley, Mitch Daniels, university presidents, leading experts in every area, healthcare, psychology, education, et cetera. And we launched with 7 principles. We said, we have to rebuild government. And the principles that we have to honor in rebuilding it, there's just 7 of them. The first one's govern for goals, and the 7th is restore the moral basis of public choices. We have to argue about public choices as matters of right and wrong. You can't go around talking about entitlements and, and give me this and give me that. Is what's the right thing to do here? It should be the question for every public choice. And so we have these 7 principles, and we're in the middle of rolling out a 16-plank platform about what it would look like to remake the schools on these principles, and remake the healthcare system on these principles, and to make public service work again on these principles. And we're in the middle of hosting forums with leading experts on this. But our goal is to bring people together to begin to have this discussion, our first goal. It's just to change the way people talk about it. So we now have got a bunch of leading think tanks on board, and they're involved in the discussion. I'd very much like to get your group involved in the discussion. And these problems are shared, I think, in many countries around the world. But I think at the bottom here, most people, people don't want to have civil wars over values or anything else. Most people just want things to work. And they want their point of view not to win, but at least to be respected and to be heard. The idea of human agency is really, maybe kind of the core human need. People need to wake up in the morning and feel that they can make a difference, that it's their ideas, it's their willpower, it's their hard work, it's their discipline make a difference. And that's not only true for people in private life, but it's true for government officials. They need it too. And by the way, if the government official doesn't have the authority, we got authority mixed up, the citizen doesn't have authority. If the principal of a school doesn't have authority to make changes, then what good are the parents' ideas or the teacher's ideas? Authority, Hannah Arendt talked about this. Authority is a concentric idea. She said, it's no coincidence that the loss of authority and the decline of freedom have occurred simultaneously. So we need to go back to a framework of principles and goals where everyone has authority not to do whatever they want, not quote discretion, but has the authority needed to take responsibility. And we need to start talking about that. We need to revive, we need to re-empower people to make a difference and re-empower other people to hold them accountable. And it's a big shift, but we're overdue for it. As I said at the beginning of the talk, things are changing, but how are they going to change? And the narrative I see on both sides is really unconstructive and terrifying. And we'd like to create one that we think would bring more people together and so that we can address the many challenges of this century that we're not addressing because we're too busy fighting with each other. Thanks for having me.
That was just terrific. I really like many of the things that you said, but particularly about the epidemic of bureaucracy, which creates the epidemic of burnout. And that would be overall on every single level where nobody can come in and change things because of the status quo of the keepers, and that makes people robots. And in my work as a psychoanalyst in stress management and company, that's what every single day I have problems with that. And trying to get people to step back and think about the way they would like to solve this and the way they can solve the issue is what gets their creativity and their motivation to be exacerbated, and they move on and they become successful in whatever they're doing. But you cannot expect everybody to go into psychoanalysis or in creative thinking, but it is very important it be done on every single level, starting from institutions that keep things status quo, like the educational system in America. And you compare it, for example, to Germany or France, it's horrible. It doesn't give the child an opportunity to be creative, but at the same time to think about other people and to follow certain rules. Just one seems to be contradicting the other. So instead of building creative human future citizens, we create robots that look at what am I doing so that I do not do something wrong. Right. And that is absolutely horrendous.
Right, and it's all about safety instead of opportunity. So we have this thing about kids. I have a friend named Lenore Skenazy who runs an organization called Let Grow, which is fighting the trend of not letting kids go out and do things by themselves. Because if the kids can't walk around the block by themselves, or they can't play with other kids unsupervised, they don't learn what the limits are. They don't learn to take responsibility. They don't, so it's infected, this kind of control instinct of avoiding error has infected every aspect of our society. It's really, really profoundly destructive.
Absolutely. Over to you, Aparv. What are the questions?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach. And I'd encourage the entire audience to sort of keep the questions flowing in. Philip, you raise a very, very important point around governance, and something that I've begun to see a lot take place in large corporates as well, as companies are beginning to understand sort of, what does conduct mean from their people? Is it just about following the rule book? And what happens, when the rule book itself is wrong? Are people equipped to take sort of judgment calls that don't neatly fall in the boxes of right and wrong? And one of the approaches that I've seen sort of the private sector begin to make is this notion about culture, and how can we begin shaping culture? So I'd like to take your opinion. If you understand sort of, the government employees and the layers of bureaucracy, to what extent is culture driving this rule book as opposed to the rule book driving the culture? You know?
It's a really excellent question. Well, first of all, we're clearly in a downward spiral. So just as polarization breeds distrust, breeds more polarization, it all goes downward. So a bad culture spawns selfish or compliance-based behavior, and which makes the culture worse, and so that's also a downward spiral. But I think the chicken and the egg here, the chicken that laid the egg, was taking away the authority of the people supposedly in charge. So if you look at studies of good cultures, good school cultures, for example, and you dig down into the culture, almost all of them the culture was a result of leadership that encouraged people to do it their own way, that didn't get people in trouble when they made mistakes or they engaged in trial and error. I mean, we forget, trial and error is the secret to all success, right? Or you just can't think up something that you know will be successful. You have to try it. And much of the time it fails. I mean, the great genius of Thomas Edison was not that he figured everything out in advance. He was like the great tinkerer of all time. He just kept trying different things. So in order to have trial and error, you have to accept error. And so the question is, within what boundaries do you accept error and such? And that's all a matter of judgment. It's a matter of leadership. But leaders there are these studies of good schools where the teachers would say, I feel really great here because I know the principal has my back. That if I try to do a good job, if it doesn't work out, he will defend me. My daughter was a teacher at a very high-performing public school in Brooklyn, and her principal spent half of Friday filling out forms, certifying that all the teachers had done things that no one had done. So she basically protected the teachers from all the red tape that was being imposed upon them by the Board of Education and by the federal government and such, by lying about it. That was the way, and that was actually quite an effective form of leadership, because now the teachers can spend their day not filling out forms, but focusing on their students. So I do think it starts at the top. And one of the things that I'm going to organize sometime in the next few months or so is have a forum on authority and culture. Because I don't think that you can rebuild a culture if you have authority. I'll give one more example. I went to Yale. Yale is really in the throes of the woke culture, where they ban speakers. It's just, it's just horrible, basically. In my view, a university president should say, we have values that we're going to uphold here. And these values include the following: letting people who are within a modicum of reasonable debate, responsible people, come and talk, even if we disagree with their point of view, as long as they're not incredibly irresponsible. We will draw that line. We will not let you stop those people from coming, because you're interfering with the rights of students to hear them. And if you do, you will be sanctioned. And if you continue to do it, you will be dismissed from the school. That's all the university president has to do. That president has the authority to do that. So why don't they do that? If you don't have that authority, if the leadership of the university say, well, we just have to do whatever the kids want, then you let this vocal minority bully everyone else, and everyone loses their freedom. The common theme of people who study the cultures now, in schools and such, is a sense that that the students have, that they have to walk on eggshells. They are no longer free to say what they want to say. Literally, we've removed people's freedom in the name of freedom. You know, it's like the reign of terror or something.
Well, it's in the name of safety. Everybody, it's as if we are creating society. The only place that they can be themselves is in their own cocoon. And as soon as they step out of the cocoon, they are pushed back right into it. So
right. That's their problem. And so in any sensible world, you say, if you need a safe space, then maybe you shouldn't be at the school. You should go someplace that's kind of, but we're an institution where we encourage people to express their ideas, even if people find them uncomfortable, you know, as long as they're within, again, a broad range of reasonableness. And you won't get that unless the people in charge, take the authority to say, these are the values of this institution. And by the way, if it's a big society, if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else.
Oh. No, I think, and it's a conundrum, right? As Dr. Durbach's mentioning as well, whenever there is an ethical breach in any institution, the immediate reaction is, let's create a stronger rule book. You know, let's create an even stricter rule book that governs standards of behavior, not realizing that it's that very rule book that's taking away from people's imagination to actually creatively think of complex solutions. And it actually exposes that institution to a greater amount of fragility to complex solutions, just as in your analogy, the woman failed to point out that the person in the next room actually could override that. But her rule book didn't tell her to recommend it to someone else in that situation, for example.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And one of the things about that is that the precondition to letting people be free, use their judgment, is that they must be accountable, not by some legal standard, but in the judgment of other people. And there's nothing more politically incorrect than to hold someone accountable, is to say to someone anything. I think you're acting immorally or inappropriately, and therefore you're dismissed. I think your work product is no good. Who are you to judge? We have this sense that somehow you can prove. So the entire public sector in the U.S. has been rebuilt on this idea that you can't get rid of a teacher unless they have, quote, due process. Well, what that means is you have to go into a legal proceeding that can take years, where you have to prove that that particular teacher is so much worse than anyone else. So due process is not a standard of fairness. It's a presumption against the action. That was the point. Government can't take your property away or throw you in jail without due process. Well, that's not the standard for managing a school. The standard ought to be, is this teacher so good, is so effective with students that we should keep her teaching the school. So we have all these kind of upside down standards that don't let people be accountable. And unless they're accountable, nobody's going to give them the freedom. So we have to do both at the same time. You have to liberate people to take responsibility, and then you have to liberate other people to use their judgment about whether they're accountable. And the notion that getting fired is somehow an affront to our humanity is a really corrosive idea. I don't know if any of you have ever been fired, but I've been fired. I mean, you can probably see why after listening to me. I have too much attitude. You can imagine how I would drive some senior partners of a law firm crazy. It's a big world. If you have something to offer, somebody will want it. It's just, the whole point of being free is that the molecules can sort themselves out in different ways. And instead we have this idea that everything's frozen. You have a job, you're entitled to the job. You know, that's just incredibly, there's a rule, you have to follow the rule. You know, everything's frozen and it's not free. And again, it's profoundly alienating and disempowering.
Well,
Yeah.
the rule books do. They make up for a imprisoned society and for robots. And if you are in charge, it's very comfortable to know that you are in charge of a group of robots that are going to do exactly what you want. I mean, this is what all the Soviet system was all about.
Right.
I mean, you either followed the rules or you ended up in gulags. And
Right.
more and more is being written about it, but this is what concerns me about a society diffused that people do not have, or you do not give
Right.
people the responsibility for
And-
taking care of themselves and their moral and ethical values.
Right. And the paradox is that the less authority that people have, including people in government, the more attracted voters are to authoritarian leaders where you don't have the intermediating institutions. You just get a power figure. And so the really important thing about re-empowering people is that you reduce the urge for people to reach out for, you know, the strong men who promised to make the trains run on time.
It's really interesting. I was observing sort of your and Dr. Durbach's conversation, Philip, and it's interesting that the entire institution is so dehumanized in terms of sort of rule books and behaviors and how it's supposed to be functioned. But as soon as there's a breach, it's blamed on a few bad apples, right? And
Right.
a few heads are fired off, but no one really ever questions the system at play,
Right.
which leads me into a question that Miss Mariam has sent, actually. Within the context of our discussion, what is the role of politicians to recreate the broken system and address the solutions we are addressing? And why do you think the American voting system allows such a desperate position and encourages separation as opposed to healthy diversity and a unifying sense of purpose, which was essentially the goal of the founding fathers of the US
Right.
Constitution?
Well, the role of politicians is ultimately to lead the changes that I'm talking about. It's not going to happen without them. So we need to build a narrative, come up with a vision, and then have political leaders embrace that vision and get elected with that vision. And then they can appoint independent recodification commissions to simplify the rules, or, you know, for this or that. Congress has already, I proposed a special pandemic commission to recommend the clear lines of authority and responsibility for dealing with pandemics. And now Congress is actually, both Senate and House, they've introduced bills for a bipartisan commission to do that. So it's really important, I think, to come up with these new visions. So we need political leaders. The political system in this country is broken. You could argue, and people do argue, that one of the reasons it's broken is because we no longer have party bosses. Paradoxically, that it's, in a sense, it's just a process without values. And then if you combine a process without values with an ability to kind of manipulate the party lines so they're safe seats, then you end up with people who take extreme positions getting into office instead of people who see their job as somehow moderating the extremes and bringing people together. So we clearly need to change the electoral system. But what I've argued to the people who are calling for electoral change, which again, I agree with, ranked choice voting and getting rid of gerrymandering in the US, that sort of thing, maybe public finance instead of private finance campaigns, is that they'll sooner get that if they have a clear vision of what the new leader should do. I mean, right now, you can elect 535 acolytes of Mother Teresa to Congress, and you could ask them, well, how are you going to make schools work? Or health care affordable, or build infrastructure, and they won't have a clue. Just because they're good and virtuous doesn't mean they have a governing vision. And so part of what we're trying to do here is create a governing vision that people can begin to understand, and a framework that then people can fight for. Just having virtuous people is not, is not a formula for successful democracy. You've got to have a sense of how that democracy should work.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very, very valid point, particularly when you think from the perspective that governments cannot function unless they have a multitude of levels of competence, bureaucracy, and ability to be able to create what is necessary for the society. Unless you have these varied components, as you just said, just because somebody is very moral or religious, that does not know that they will know how to build a bridge or how to fix a road or become a plumber. That's very, very true. And somehow we are not addressing that. I think that that's when I say that, America was built on people that came here with the willingness to make a better life for themselves and to put in the time and energy and work to be able to do that. Because otherwise, if you have nothing and you expect the government to take care of you or somebody else to think of you, you have a very inadequate society.
Right. So there has to be a sense of what the values are, what the frameworks are, what the authority hierarchy should be. You need a vision of how things will work, just like if you were running a company or anything else. And we don't have that vision now. We just have people thrashing about in a red tape jungle.
Well, also we have people also that the only thing that they are interested in is making money, no matter how. I mean, people that are basically do not have a responsibility toward society. They only have a responsibility toward themselves. We have a lot of those.
That's true, and but you'll get people engaged in public life, in my view, only when you persuade them that their ideas can actually make a difference. It's not very persuasive to go to somebody and say, be virtuous, give up more of your money, or whatever. But if you go to somebody and say, if you get involved with this school system, your ideas can be acted upon, and you might help turn this terrible school into a great school. People are interested in accomplishment, and lots of studies on this. And if you give a chance for people to make a difference, you'll get more people involved. Whereas by creating this kind of system of automatic government where you just follow the rules and you can't make a difference, then people tune out. So most of my friends, I was basically a Wall Street lawyer. Most of my friends tuned out. It's not that they're not civic minded. They give money away. They sit on charitable boards, but they don't really, they're not invested in most of them, in making things work, because they don't see the opportunities to do that.
No, my father was a lawyer, so he always used to say that one of the big problems in America, that there is no protocol for the big things, and there's only protocols for the minutiae. They keep the protocols continuing on without any change, regardless of what is happening and who is suffering the consequences.
Right.
Philip, I have 5 people asking me the same question. Do you believe in term limits?
Well, that's interesting. I believe in disruption of the current system to make a change. And I think term limits could be very effective in creating a new cohort of leaders who could do the sort of thing we're talking about, who are not beholden to the status quo. So yes, I believe in term limits, but as a long-term systemic solution to a healthy democracy, I do not believe in term limits. The studies of term limits show that the people who are term limited come into office, they spend all their time doing favors for some special interest that will then give them a job when they get out. So it doesn't, in fact, solve the problem they're trying to solve. At the moment, because the system is so embedded in legal concrete, I'm for term limits because we need a new cohort of people. But people should not think that just because you have term limits that all of a sudden democracy is going to work well. They have term limits in California, and if anything, the legislature is a lot worse than it used to be.
Yeah. Brilliant. Go ahead, Dr. Durbach.
No, I was just going to mention that I think one of the problems, I think the term limits is not a bad idea. However, I think on, for example, like the office of the president, I think 4 years is very, very little to do anything. I think if you're going to be able to create a significant change, you need a minimum of 6 years. 4 years. If you are elected for 4 years, 2 years you're doing something, and then the next 2 you are working to make sure that you get reelected. So it doesn't give you the time to actually finish or complete any kind of task.
Yeah, Philip, one's on the role of news media. So what do you think is the role of news media to communicate information as it has become more and more biased based on partisanship? Do you feel Common Good, your organization, has an effective role similar to news media in a way?
Well, news media, first of all, news media, different avenues come at it from different points of view. I don't really object to that so much as long as they honor basic norms of truthfulness.
Yeah.
In opinion, you know, I think having a point of view is not, I think there's no such thing as a neutral point of view. I think my biggest problem with the media is that they're reactive. And so that they only talk about what people are saying. So they're, you know, every day Donald Trump steps on another landmine. And so every day there's a big headline, Trump steps on landmine, you know, it's just every single day, there's no oxygen in the room. And so no one except a few columnists talk about what people are not talking about. So to me, the story of modern politics is what people are not talking about. Because what they're saying is so boring, they might as well be lemmings from 20 years ago, you know, still continuing to fly off the cliff. So the media, I think, has really been useless in actually analyzing the problems of society. They just react, and they're making so much money on Donald Trump because he's so much outrage, you know. So the worse the news, the more money the media makes. So I think they've done a terrible job. Common Good is not pretending to be a media organization. We're presenting. I'd say my aspiration is to be a combination of like an economic philosopher, where we talk about and we bring leading thinkers together to talk about, well, what are the conditions for human accomplishment and human satisfaction that are, and public accomplishment that are not being met now. And it's just so obvious they're not being met and people aren't talking about it. So we're trying to lead, on the one hand, we're trying to lead a kind of an intellectual conversation about the nature of institutional authority and what those frameworks should be. And on the other hand, we're trying to play a kind of political role, nonpartisan, but a political role in bringing coalitions of groups and thinkers together. And it's certainly not media. I mean, we have our own hypotheses. We have our own vision. Go to commongood.org. We've got platforms.
Yeah.
We're looking for ideas. We're looking for people to disagree, but we want to engage this conversation. And part of our frustration is, I think at some point soon, the media ought to talk about what we're talking about. They don't have to agree with what we're doing, but they need to talk about why it's significant to understand the public paralysis that's so frustrating. I mean, the surveys are overwhelming. 2/3 of American, according to the University of Chicago poll, believe in major structural overhaul of government. Americans hate Washington. The media is not talking about that. The Democratic Party doesn't have one page on overhauling the system to make the system work better.
Because their ratings are based on sort of just toting the line.
I guess. The only thing that gives me comfort is the truth of what we've been talking about. Nothing works unless a person makes it work. So have we created those conditions in schools and hospitals and public agencies? And do the firefighters have that condition? Or the public health researchers trying to catch COVID? And the answer to that is no, they don't. So we're talking about it, you're talking about it, but the media is not talking about it.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent point to leave it as well. Dr. Derbach, wouldn't you say the system doesn't work until the people do?
I just wanted to say that thank you for a very, very enlightening lecture. And it has given a lot of food for thought to all of our listeners. So thank you for taking your time, and we're most grateful.
Well, it's great to be with you, and please sign up at commongood.org. It's free, and if you have any ideas or any way to spread the word, please do so.
I'll do that. Over to you, Alper.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philip and Dr. Derbach, for joining another series of Virtual Voices. And to all of our audience who's joined from around the world, please, I would encourage you to visit commongood.org, Philip's organization, to learn more about what principle-based law means and essentially how can you help the organization create better governance. Thank you once again, Philip, for joining us and for everyone around the world. Thank you.
Thanks.